pedagogy. Now, what do we do with all of that? So, this is Dr. McKenzie, and I just wanted to give you a quick insight on some of those learning artifacts that we have been talking about. In designing training, there are different concepts we have visited, such as the needs analysis, the learner profile, context analysis, task, etc. And one of the things that we are in the final straightaway is to create those learning artifacts. And I call them artifacts because it's a number of things. You've heard me talk about facilitator guides, participant guides, the slide deck, the infamous slide deck that we normally use, and then some other things. Well, on my screen, you're looking at what I call the participant workbook. And this is just an example I got from the web, going to Google and just typing the term participant guide. And this was really good. But let me walk you through a couple of things. Some of the examples that we have talked about in the past, we haven't necessarily used them, are infographics, which are really good pieces of information that allow you to get a lot of content in a very small amount of space. So right now on the screen, I'm showing you what would be an infographic. This piece is actually something created by one of my students in another class. So as I zoom in, you can see the infographic is vertical in nature. There are other infographics that are more horizontal. And so depending on the layout, of course, depending on the software you use to create it, etc. This one is created with a software called PictoChart. It's for free, and you can create basic infographics. There are certain limitations, but it allows you to lay out some content, as you can see, that you can then take users and walk them through in a chronological manner. The task in this case was for the students to condense the information from a chapter around the knowledge analysis, the knowledge and skills assessment or analysis. And they had different steps to follow. So they took the information, they synthesized it, and then they figured out images that would help. So as you can see, this is a good balance of text and images that you would potentially glance at the information and get enough ideas to walk away with more understanding of the topic. Also, another thing that you can use the infographics for are to present a lot of heavy information that are numerical in nature, and you have graphics to convey the ideas. You can definitely balance off the talking points and some of the graphics that support those talking points. So the infographics are a very helpful learning artifact that you can utilize in your training. Ways in which you can use it: if you have facts that you like people to know before you have them analyze or evaluate any type of knowledge, you can just transfer knowledge. Or if you want them to compare or evaluate, you can also provide them side-by-side information on something like this, an infographic. So there is the first option, very quick, easy to create, and that is an example of an artifact. Another example is what I was showing you earlier, which is the participant guide. So on the screen, you see, actually, let me show you that's the full page. And this participant guide or workbook is essentially on a piece of paper, and you can do double-sided printing, etc. It's from the Center for Disease Control. Actually, they put it together, and it's very interesting because it does refer to our content. They have an index chart, of course, and then you have seen some of the examples that I have shared with you in the past. There is an introduction to the program, and they are actually training on Sustainable Management Development Program, and they tell you a little bit more about it. They have a website where people can go, acknowledgments in terms of content, and then of course you get into the objectives. These may be familiar, so let me zoom in a little bit. Here are the objectives. There is the schedule. It seems like it's a day and a half of training. Then you have some icons, glossary in terms of when you see X, this is what we mean. And then of course the participant guide begins. In the past I have shown you, and actually I'll go ahead and share this with you since it's public, it's on the website. I'm going to give you the URL where I got it from so you can go there and look at it for yourself. But I will show it to you. I'll share a link so you can go see it. It's a very well done participant guide in that it has a good balance. As you saw, the previous page had a lot of blanks where participants can enter information, but on the next or subsequent pages you have an information and you have spaces for the participant to enter their notes or what they interpreted in terms of the information. This is really good because sometimes you don't want people to memorize context or memorize lines or words or phrases. You want them to interpret them, and so giving them the space to write down with their own words what they understand in terms of a context or in terms of a term is definitely more helpful. On this next page, as you can see, there are some graphics that are guiding the learner into, in this case, the levels of learning. Well, we know a little bit about this. And of course, they use graphics which allow for the participant to fill in the spaces in blank. So this is primarily designed for paper use, not necessarily for online. And of course, the beauty of it, as I mentioned, is the fact that you can guide the participant with some information. You can leave them with blank spaces so they can interact with the guide, and you can also provide context in terms of what you want to do. So this looks familiar. I'm sure you remember we did an exercise on this. So and so on and so forth. So you get an idea on a participant guide. Generally, I say a participant guide is important because if you give nothing to the participant of a training event, they will walk away with absolutely nothing. The primary reason why I say that is because you're relying on the auditory channel. When you deliver a lot of information in an auditory manner, number one, you are assuming that everyone is primarily a listener, and also that they have the ability to capture information from an auditory channel and record it into long-term memory, and later they can use it to process. And that sometimes is not the case. So that's why it's important to provide them with something in writing or something in print so they can refer back to, so they can create those milestones or landmarks, if you will. I call them cognitive landmarks. So they remember when they see a sign or when they see an icon or when they see a graphic, they will remember that there was a topic of conversation or there was a point that meant something for them while they were listening to the facilitator speak or when they were listening to a discussion in a group setting. So it is important to always have something. So the participant guide is very important. But on the other side of the coin, we also have the facilitator guide, which you have heard me talk about. And I would say that in the early stages of becoming an instructional designer, people may or may not see the benefit of a facilitator guide, but as a seasoned instructional designer, I can tell you that it is imperative that we create a facilitator guide. Now, the looks of it will depend. The example that you're seeing right now on a participant guide on the screen has a certain design to it. Very simple, but it does have structure. There's text, there are tables, etc. The facilitator guide would follow something similar. You will need something like tables or chunks of information, icons, so the facilitator knows when the attention is directed to them, and also when they can use some thoughts and use them with the participants. So the facilitator guide is extremely important. And of course, the presentation or the deck, as we call it affectionately, you are either going to project something on the screen or you're going to use flip charts or you're going to use post-it notes or post-it boards in the training space that you can refer the participants to. So this is another one of those artifacts, and perhaps this is the one type that you should focus the most. So the participant guide and the facilitator guide. Again, is the facilitator guide imperative? I'd say no. At some point you can definitely create a training event without it, but how successful is it going to be for you to give it to somebody else and execute it? And that's where you probably will find out, unfortunately, that without a facilitator guide, it's really difficult for someone to execute the training or the learning experience as you designed it. So think about that. Okay, so the next thing that I like to take you to is graphics. So in the past, you have probably seen, and I know that many of you know, that the graphic design artistry is something geared mostly for marketing, etc. This website, which I'm also going to put on the notes so you can refer back to it, this is a very good website. As you can see, the title, it contains 20 great resources for learning graphics and design. But among those things, and I want to highlight a few, but you can definitely take a look at some examples. Well, the reason why I bring you to the graphic design space is because you will need graphic design no matter what. So look at the screen right now. We're looking at the first tip. Typography, rules, and terms every designer must know. So if you think about a facilitator guide, a participant guide, a deck, an infographic, or anything like that, typography will definitely be one of those elements you will have to deal with. So knowing those basic rules, do you want to use Arial? Do you want to use Times New Roman? Do you want to use sans serifs? What is the most appropriate font size? When do you use bold? When do you use heavy ink? When do you use black ink, etc.? Ultra thin, ultra light, and all of that. So it's almost imperative that we know those basics. Of course, in real life, you could, if you have enough money or your team has enough money, you can even hire a graphic designer and give that person your artifacts, and then they will finalize them. But if they don't have, the department doesn't have that luxury, financially speaking, of hiring an a graphic designer, you will have to do it yourself. So that's why graphics are so important. Anyway, so on these resources, the things that I wanted to highlight, there are plenty. There are 20 of them, but I wanted to highlight a few. So typography is definitely one. Another thing that you probably want to get into is the key terms. Some of the terminology that is used among graphic designers. That's when we start talking about font size, when we start talking about dimensions, when we start talking about resolution, things of that nature. Another thing that I wanted you guys to take a peek at is a design styles guide. So let me go back. There you go. So the grid theory is also very important. Here on the screen you see it. Grid meaning when you're going to create charts, when you're going to break the page in certain segments. So that's why the grids become important. But this is what I was talking about, the design style guide. This is important because if you're going to have a department or if you're going to develop multiple training materials, you want to use a basic standard. So you want to develop your guide so that everyone who is developing materials for your project has the similar ideas or benchmarking for how to do it. Another one that is very important is also the balanced page layout, as you can see here. So that's important. And then another one that is really good is this number 11, how to master the color theory. If you've noticed, color is something very, very important. If we don't use it correctly, we are going to detract people from our materials. If we use color very effectively, we are going to have participants drawn to our materials. So there is always a lot to learn in terms of how we use color, especially for somebody who is not a native graphic designer. So it's important to take a look at that. And then there are other things like the color balance, and of course you see here other tips, how to design business cards. And if you keep on going, you see other things like a podcast on graphic design. I would recommend, if you have a few minutes, go ahead and take a listen to it. You may learn something different. And of course, here's a rule on how to create perfect infographics. If you remember, I opened this podcast in relation to that, infographics, as a learning artifact. So there are quite a few solutions. There are quite a few resources. You can definitely Google now more than before. But definitely, I'd like you to keep in mind that when you are designing training, is not just the objectives. It's not just the learning theory that we're going to use, it's also how we are going to create those materials that are going to convey the experience or create the experience for the learner. So think about the multiple resources and think about what is going to make sense for you to create and put in front of your learners, depending on the topic, depending on the audience. And that's why the profile is so important, and the context and task analysis are so important in this trade. So I hope this helps, and I wish you success on your design of learning artifacts. Thank you.